Hello everyone, welcome to part 1 of 6 regarding the topic of planning of resources or resource planning. And for this first topic, I want to talk with you about project budget, which is an extremely important document to create in order to understand how much a project will actually spend. So the project budget, the official definition is that it's the approved estimate for the project or any work breakdown structure component or any schedule activity. In other words, what we're going to do is basically try to plan, and we have to plan is the cost of performing each one of the tasks that we determine for the project that we have. Normally the budget, I mean, there is different alternatives, but one of my favorites and the best one in my opinion is to do a time-based budget, which means that you're going to have different, a big Excel sheet with different columns, different rows, and typically each column will represent a time period and each row will represent a task on your project. And then for each column you would have a total and you would have a cumulative total, and obviously on this budget you have to include the two big components of cost plus one extra, which is the cost of materials or anything that you need to buy for the project, the cost of labor, and obviously any other costs you might have as well need to be incorporated in the budget. So the steps to create a budget is relatively simple. First, you list all the activities you have in the project. Then you estimate how much effort you're going to need for each one of those tasks. And then you convert that effort into money. So for example, if you know it takes 10 hours and the people normally, the average salary of people working on your team is $80, for example, then the cost of labor for that task would be $800. Then you convert and then you place that costs in the appropriate column. Obviously, you add as well the things that you need to buy. I will show an example later. And finally, you sum each column and create the cumulative sum. So this is what a budget typically will look like, and I pointed out some important components. So over here on this big column over here, this is all the tasks that we have in the project. This is a small project, only 20 tasks, and we list them all over here. The next thing we have is our estimates, and our estimates are located in these two different columns over here: estimates for labor cost and estimates for purchases, things that we have to buy. And then obviously we add a total just to make things easier, okay, to make it easier later on to distribute, and that's our estimates. Then we have to divide that according to the correct time. So for example, task 1 happens in February, so the whole cost goes into February. Task 2 happens in February and March, so I divided the 6,400 into two different components. I'm going to show in a little bit an exercise on how to do it. And these numbers that you see over here, these numbers over here, we call that the time-phased costs. Then on this first column over here, on this first line, sorry, at the bottom, we have, sorry for my drawing skills on mouse, they are horrible. We have our period totals, and finally the very last column, the very last line that we have over there, it's the cumulative summary. And cumulative summary basically tells us, it basically will tell us how much have we spent so far in the project. So for example, in February I spent a total of 5,600. So by February I spent a total of $5,600. In March, my total cost was $469,600. So by the end of March, I spent a total of $4,075,200. How do I calculate that? It's basically the total of this month plus the previous cumulative value. But I will show you in a little bit an example. Let me get right into it, actually. So here I have an example of an exercise that I have to create for a budget. I went along and I actually did here. I have my 20 tasks here, and then I have how many hours of work each one would take. And then as well I have is the purchases for this one that I have. Okay, what materials I need to purchase for some tasks. Okay, and finally here I will have my totals. Let me just delete this for now because I want to show you how to calculate it. So to calculate labor costs, if you know the amount of hours, all you have to do is multiply each one of the hours. So in this case, 30. Now let's imagine that the average rate of my team is $50. So I'm going to multiply it by 50. Then for the second one, I will do 80 hours multiplied by $50, and I will get all my totals there. Okay, so this is all my totals for each task, how much I would spend in labor. Then my total column is very simple. All I have to do is to add the purchased costs, in this case for the first one is 0, plus the labor cost. And I would get my, in this case, the total for task 1 is 1,500. And then I use the same formula, there you go, for all of it. So for example, now I know that task 2 requires $14,000 of cost, task 5 requires $25,000, and so on, so on. There's a couple of totals here I believe are important to do, and I'm going to do those totals as an auto sum right there. So for example, on this project alone, I'm spending a total of 3,140 hours. The total cost of labor for this project is 157,000. The total cost of materials for this project is 210,000, and the total cost of this project is 367,000. Now this is a very important number because later on it will help me determine if my exercise is correct or not. So now it's time for us to divide our costs according to the months. For now, I'm going to keep it simple, and you're going to see that, for example, what we see is that task 1 happens entirely in February, so I'm just going to add the total cost of task 1 to February. Task 2, on the other hand, happens between February and March. Now, I could be more complicated, but I'm going to keep it simple and really just divide the total cost of this task into 2 parts. Okay, I divided by 2, so I decided to put half of the cost in February, half of the cost in March. I know it's not very realistic, but for this exercise, it's I just want to show you how to do the exercise. So I'm going to keep it this way, which is called, by the way, this is called a level loaded type of distribution. Therefore, all the money is distributed according to the same level. Then task 3 happens entirely in March, so I put the whole cost there. Task 4 entirely in March, task 5 entirely in March, task 6 entirely in March, and then we have task 7. Task 7 happens entirely in April, task 8 entirely in April, task 9 now happens in April and May. So I have, once again, I'm going to divide it by 2 and I distribute it there. Task 10 entirely in May, task 11 May, then May again, and then once again here May and June, so I have to divide it by 2 and distribute that in the 2 months. All right, and finally now we go to task 14 again, May and June. I have to divide it by 2 once again. Go. This one here happens all in June, perfect. This one June and July, so once again I have to divide it by 2. Task 17 July completely, July, and then we have 2 tasks that happen in August. And this is how I do the distribution. Now if you want to check very quickly, for example, if you made a mistake, what you can do is simply do the sum of this entire column. Right, then you go here to the formula Tn and you take out the total that is here. Okay, and if you get zeros, that means you distributed everything at least in totals, it's correct. There you go, so it's 100% correct in terms of distribution numbers. Next 2 things we do is relatively simple. Now it's just a matter of doing our sums for each month. So I do an auto sum here for February. So in February I spend a total of 8,500, and then I do the same auto sum for all of them, and there you go. Okay, so now I have my totals per month. The last thing to do is to calculate my cumulative values, and for my cumulative values it's simple. The first cumulative value you just copy down, so you just copy the same number, it's there on top. For the next ones it's a little bit similar. It's going to be the one that is on top plus the previous cumulative value. Right, so 8,500 plus 48,000. Then the next one would be 26,500 plus 57,000. So I'm just going to copy that formula now, and boom. Now at the end, if these 2 numbers need to be correct, and if you got them correct, then your exercise is most probably correct as well. And this is how we do a budget. So some special cases now that I want to let you know. As I told you before, many things we have to buy from outside suppliers or from contractors. And here it is important for us to determine what is the date of items that you purchase, because there's 3 different options. You can register the cost on the day you put the order, you can register the cost the day you receive the products or the service, and you can register the cost the day that you pay for them. Now, these can be three completely different dates. To be honest, in my opinion, it's not very important which one you use. I prefer to use purchase order date. That way I register the cost as soon as possible. But the important thing is that if you decide to use purchase date for one, then you have to use that one for all the purchases that you make. You cannot switch according to what your need is, because then it's going to be a very unrealistic budget. Second thing I want to say is about estimating the cost of long tasks. I showed you before that if we have a long task that happens in 2 months, 2 different months, for example, I said just divide the cost by 2. This is one option. The other option is you can do more on an event loaded, for example. And you say, for example, okay, instead of registering like this, let's imagine I do 80% of the work in January, so I'm going to put 80% of the budget on January and only 20% on the next month, February. Now, obviously, this is a good technique as well. Based on this one, what I do is I focus more on the milestones of the task itself. So, for example, I only register the cost the moment the task is complete. When do I plan to complete that task, for example? The other one is about planning reserves. Now, typically reserves is money you separate in case there's a problem, and the higher the risk of the project, the higher your reserve should be. Typically, I try to give reserves, and when we say reserves, does not only mean the reserves of money, can also be reserves of time. And I tend to put some of those reserves when more close to tasks that I believe are risky, or I tend to also create a specific task called the risk reserve task, and that task is there to give me a little bit of flexibility on the project in case things go wrong. Finally, some tips and tricks that I would like to point out. Make sure when you're creating the budget that you identify all the activities that have a cost associated. Tip number 2 is, if your budget is fixed, but somehow the work you have to do is a little bit flexible, then divide your budget by phases, and then for each phase you prioritize the work. Once you run out of money for that phase, then you stop and move to the next phase. If you have long projects, my suggestion is to put as well the end of one of the tasks to end with the end of the fiscal year, because a lot of times this can be much easier to obtain the necessary budgets you want. And finally, if you're working with many different countries on your project, be careful with exchange rates. So that's it in terms of budget, and as you can see, it's not that hard, but it is something that demands a lot of work. I gave you an example with 20 tasks, but typically a project will have hundreds, if not thousands, of different tasks. Remember though that not all tasks need to be budgeted, only the ones that have a necessary cost associated with them. That's it for this video. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you on the next video of this mini series.